This is a story from my own life, and it's not an easy one to tell, but it's the truth. Some betrayals don't just break your heart, they give you a reason to rebuild yourself out of iron. The weight of the navy blue leather folder on the white tablecloth between us felt heavier than a tombstone. We were at Mama Maria in Boston's North End, the city lights of downtown twinkling through the window as Richard, my husband of 10 years and business partner of 12, smiled a smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. I thought this was a celebration, the final toast before we submitted our bid for the Blackwood Building, the project that was meant to be our legacy. But as his hand slid the folder towards me, I saw the truth in the sharp crease of his smile. This wasn't a celebration, it was an execution. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. Our company, Von Hayes Properties, wasn't just a business, it was the third entity in our marriage. We had built it from nothing. I was the heart, the one with the vision for spaces, the one who could walk into a derelict warehouse and see luxury lofts, who could sketch a community hub on a cocktail napkin. Richard was the numbers, the cold, hard logic. He was brilliant with financing, with legal loopholes, with the brutal chess game of Boston real estate. He called us the perfect partnership, the artist and the architect. I, foolishly, believed him. The Blackwood Building was supposed to be our masterpiece. A historic, Gothic revival behemoth in the financial district, it had sat vacant for decades, a sleeping giant. Everyone else saw a money pit, a gut job nightmare. I saw a boutique hotel with a rooftop bar overlooking the harbor, ground floor artisan shops, a testament to the city's past and future. It was my dream, my design, my passion. Richard's job was to make the numbers work. For 2 years, we'd poured our lives into it. We'd schmoozed city officials, spent hundreds of thousands on architectural surveys and environmental reports, and lined up a consortium of investors, all under Richard's careful management. "Open it, Elara," he said, his voice smooth as polished granite. He took a sip of his Macallan 18, watching me over the rim of the glass. My hands trembled as I untied the silk ribbon. Inside wasn't our final bid proposal. It was a partnership dissolution agreement. My name was at the top, followed by paragraphs of dense legalese that swam before my eyes. I saw figures, percentages, clauses of non-competition. It felt like a foreign language, but the meaning was brutally clear. He was cutting me out. Not just from the Blackwood deal, but from the company we had built together. "Richard, what is this?" My voice was a whisper, a tiny, fragile thing in the warm, buzzing restaurant. "It's the next step," he said calmly, placing his glass down with a soft click. "The investors, the bank, they need a singular vision. A steady hand. The Blackwood project is too big, too important for sentiment." The word hung in the air, putrid. "Sentiment?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "My sentiment is what found the building. My sentiment is the entire design concept you used to secure the financing." He sighed, a theatrical display of patience that was more insulting than any shout. "Elara, darling, you're brilliant. Truly. Your creativity is your gift. But this is the big leagues. It's $100 million deal. There's no room for emotion. You get too attached to the projects, to the people. You see buildings as homes, I see them as assets. And the investors, they prefer my perspective. You're just too emotional for this level of business." There it was. The phrase he'd used as a weapon for years, a quiet little dagger he'd slip between my ribs whenever my passion became inconvenient for him. When I argued against evicting a long-term tenant. When I wanted to invest more in community green spaces. When I cried after we lost a bid we'd worked on for months. Too emotional. It was his checkmate, his way of invalidating my contributions and framing his ruthlessness as strength. The folder detailed a buyout. A number that, to an outsider, might seem generous. But I knew what the company was worth, what the Blackwood deal alone would spin off. This wasn't a buyout, it was a pittance. It was trash thrown to a dog he was kicking out of the house. I could feel the blood draining from my face, the stares of the couple at the next table boring into me. Humiliation washed over me, hot and suffocating. Our entire life is in that company, I managed to say, my throat tight. Our home, our friends, you can't just, I can, he interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, chilling register. And I have. This is cleaner. No messy boardroom fights, no public drama. You sign, you walk away with a clean break and a comfortable life, and I secure our legacy. My legacy. He had it all planned. Every contingency, every angle. While I was dreaming of color palettes and custom fixtures for our masterpiece, he was meticulously plotting my exile. I looked at the man across the table, the man I had loved, the man whose children I once thought I would have. And I saw a complete stranger. A predator looking at his prey. His lawyer, a slick shark named Marcus Thorne, slid into the seat beside him, appearing as if from a puff of smoke. He didn't even look at me, just opened his own folder and pointed to a signature line. It's a very standard agreement, Elara, Marcus said, his voice devoid of any warmth. We've been working on it for months to ensure it's fair to all parties. Months. The word echoed in the sudden silence of my mind. This wasn't a last-minute decision. This was a long, calculated betrayal. Richard and Marcus were already talking, their voices a low murmur, discussing the final call to the bank, the timeline for the bid submission. I was a ghost at my own execution. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. Richard looked up, annoyed by the interruption. Don't make a scene, Elara. That was all he said. I didn't say a word. I took the folder, put it in my purse, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the life I knew behind me. The cold Boston air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't as cold as the realization of what had just happened. He hadn't just stolen my business. He'd stolen my past and tried to steal my future. As I stood on the cobbled street of the North End, a cab splashing through a puddle beside me, one thought burned through the fog of shock and grief, clear and hard as a diamond. He thought I was too emotional. He had no idea how much emotion could be forged into fuel. The drive back to our Back Bay brownstone was a blur. The familiar streets, the gas lamps of Beacon Hill casting a golden glow on the brick sidewalks, all looked alien and menacing. Our home, a place I had lovingly restored from a crumbling Victorian shell, felt like an enemy stronghold. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors. Every piece of art, every stick of furniture, was something we'd chosen together. Now, it all felt like a lie, stage dressing for a decade-long play where I was the only one who didn't know my role was temporary. In the shared office, his side of the massive oak desk was pristine, organized, clinical. My side was a chaotic collage of sketches, fabric swatches, and architectural magazines. The artist and the architect. What a fraud. I sat in his leather chair, the scent of his cologne still lingering, and opened the folder again. Under the sterile light of the desk lamp, the words were even more brutal. He was dissolving our shared company, Vaughan Hayes, and simultaneously founding a new one, Vaughan Legacy Ventures. All assets, all investor agreements, all contracts, including the entire Blackwood proposal, were being transferred to his new entity. I was being offered a one-time payment in exchange for my half of the original company and a non-disclosure agreement so tight I couldn't even tell our friends what he'd done without being sued into oblivion. It was a perfect, bloodless coup. But Richard had one critical flaw: arrogance. He believed he was the smartest person in any room, and he believed I was the emotional, creative fool who couldn't possibly understand the intricacies of his world. He assumed I'd crumble, cry, and eventually take the check just to make the pain go away. He'd underestimated me for the last time. For the next 3 hours, I wasn't a heartbroken wife. I was a forensic accountant. I turned on our shared server, my mind racing. If this had been in the works for months, there had to be a digital trail. He was meticulous, but he was also confident I'd never look. I started with the Blackwood folder, cross-referencing every financial statement with our bank records. It took me an hour to find the first crack. A series of payments to a consulting firm I'd never heard of, Nightingale Strategy Group. The payments were listed under geotechnical surveys, but they were round numbers, paid monthly, starting 8 months ago. It smelled wrong. I searched the server for Nightingale. Nothing. He'd have hidden it better than that. I thought about how Richard organized his life, his digital world. Everything was compartmentalized. He had a different password protocol for his personal files. I tried his college nickname, his mother's maiden name, his beloved boat's name. Nothing. Then I thought about his ego. What was the one thing he was proudest of? His first solo deal, a small condo conversion in Charlestown that he'd leveraged into our seed capital. The building was on a street named Kettner. I typed in, Kettner 78. Access granted. A hidden partition on the server opened up, revealing a handful of folders. One was labeled, Project Nightingale. My blood ran cold. It was all there. Memos between Richard and Marcus. Drafts of the dissolution agreement going back 6 months. Emails with their new investors, where they openly discussed the strategy to phase Elara out post-creative, pre-execution. They had used me. They had squeezed every last drop of my vision, my passion, my design talent, and the moment my part was done, the moment it was time to capitalize on it, they had slated me for removal. They described me in the emails as the asset with the highest emotional liability. In one email, Richard had written to the lead investor, "Don't worry about Elara. I've been managing that situation for years. She's a brilliant artist, but at the end of the day, she hasn't got the stomach for the kill. I do." I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to grip the desk to keep from falling. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a vivisection of my life, performed by the one person I trusted implicitly, and he'd been doing it while kissing me goodnight each evening. The worst was yet to come. In a subfolder labeled BW Financials, I found the document that changed everything. It was a preliminary loan commitment from Boston Merchant Bank for the Blackwood acquisition. It was dated 5 months ago. And it was made out solely to Vaughn Legacy Ventures. He had secured the funding for my dream project, using my designs, under a company I had no part in, months before he ever told me. He had been lying to my face every single day. My grief, hot and sharp only hours before, began to cool, hardening into something else. It was a cold, quiet rage that settled deep in my bones. He thought I didn't have the stomach for the kill. He had no idea what a woman could do when her entire world was burned to the ground. She learns to eat fire. I copied the entire contents of the hidden partition onto a thumb drive, a tiny silver stick that now held the truth of my husband's treachery. I walked out of the office, leaving the lights on. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was going to get his legacy. But it wouldn't be the one he had planned. It would be the story of how his, too emotional, wife dismantled his empire, piece by piece, starting with the prize he wanted most. My fight for the Blackwood Building had just begun. The next morning, I met him in the sun-drenched breakfast nook of our home. He was already dressed in a tailored suit, sipping an espresso, scrolling through the Wall Street Journal on his tablet. He looked up as I entered, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that I was even there. He clearly expected me to have retreated to a friend's house or my mother's, to be weeping into a phone. "Elara," he said, his tone cautious, as if approaching a spooked animal. "Did you sleep? We should talk." "I read the agreement," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the hysteria he was anticipating. I placed the thumb drive on the table between us. It was a small, insignificant object, but it landed with the force of a grenade. He glanced at it, then back at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. "And this?" "This is everything from Project Nightingale," I said. "The emails with Marcus, the side deals with the investors, the loan agreement you secured for Vaughn Legacy Ventures 5 months ago. This is the story of how you've been planning to destroy me." The color drained from his face. The mask of calm concern dissolved, replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted fury. He had been caught, and he hated it. For a moment, I thought he might lunge across the table, but he visibly composed himself, straightening his tie, his features hardening into the smug, arrogant mask I now recognized as his true face. He leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound that made my skin crawl. My God, Elara. A little bit of late-night snooping. I'm almost impressed. But what do you think that changes? You found some paperwork. Congratulations. It doesn't change a thing. It changes everything, Richard. It's fraud. You used our company's resources, my work, to secure a deal for a company that doesn't even legally exist yet, all while misrepresenting the state of our partnership to our investors. It's business, he shot back, his voice like ice. It's aggressive, it's smart, and it's perfectly legal. Marcus has made sure of that. Every I is dotted. You think you can take that little stick to a judge? They'll laugh you out of court. All it proves is that I'm a better businessman than you are. I saw an opportunity to streamline an operation and remove a weak link. That link was you. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was proud of it. A weak link? I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I poured my soul into this company. And you were compensated handsomely for it, he said, his voice rising. You lived a life you could only have dreamed of. But you never understood what it takes to win. You wanted to build monuments, I want to build an empire. Empires aren't built on soul, Elara. They're built on power. On leverage. And you have none. He stood up, towering over me. So take your little thumb drive. Take it to a lawyer. Spend the pittance I'm offering you on legal fees that will go nowhere. By the time you're done, I'll be breaking ground on Blackwood. You had a chance to walk away with dignity and 8 figures. You want to declare war? You'll end up with nothing. He picked up his briefcase, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out of the room without a backward glance. The finality of it was like a door slamming shut on my life. He was right. I knew he was. I spent the afternoon with a lawyer, a sharp woman in a corner office overlooking the harbor. She listened patiently, reviewed the documents on the thumb drive, and gave me the grim prognosis. Richard's legal firewall was, as he'd boasted, perfect. He had used shared assets, yes, but he had structured it all as a series of complex internal loans and consulting fees. It was unethical, it was morally bankrupt, but it was technically legal. A lawsuit would be a long, bloody, and expensive war of attrition, one I was likely to lose. She advised me to take the settlement. I walked out of her office feeling smaller and more powerless than I ever had in my life. The city felt oppressive, the tall buildings like tombstones of other people's ambitions. Richard had won. He had all the power, all the money, all the connections. I was just the emotional artist he'd cast aside. I wandered aimlessly, my feet eventually carrying me to the Boston Public Garden. I sat on a bench facing the pond, watching the swan boats glide by, filled with laughing tourists. The world kept moving, oblivious to the fact that mine had just ended. It was there, in the depths of my despair, that I saw him. Arthur Vance. He was a legend in Boston real estate, a titan from the old school who had shaped the city's skyline in the 70s and 80s. He was in his late 70s now, semi-retired, with a reputation for being as cantankerous as he was brilliant. Richard had always been dismissively scornful of him, calling him a dinosaur who didn't understand the modern world of finance. Old Vance is still playing checkers while we're playing 3D chess, Richard used to say. Arthur was sitting on a nearby bench, feeding the pigeons, looking lost in thought. Something inside me, a tiny, flickering ember of defiance that Richard hadn't managed to extinguish, sparked. Richard's arrogance was his greatest strength, but it was also his greatest weakness. He dismissed anyone he didn't see as a threat. He had dismissed me. He had dismissed Arthur Vance. An idea, wild and improbable, began to form in my mind. It was a crazy, desperate gamble, a Hail Mary pass in the final second of the game. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, and walked towards the old lion of Boston real estate. He looked up as I approached, his pale blue eyes sharp and intelligent. He didn't know me, but he would. I sat down on the bench, not too close, giving him his space. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of spring blossoms and city exhaust. The moment of resolve was here. My turning point. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice steadier than I thought possible. "My name is Elara Hayes. You don't know me, but you know my husband, Richard Vaughn." A flicker of recognition, and distaste, crossed his face. "I need your advice," I continued, my voice gaining strength with every word. "My husband is trying to steal my future, and I'm going to take his instead." Arthur Vance looked at me for a long moment, his gaze sharp and appraising. He scattered the last of his birdseed, the pigeons fluttering around his feet, and then turned his full attention to me. "Richard Vaughn's wife," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. I always wondered what kind of woman would marry a man with a calculator for a heart. There was no pity in his eyes, only a shrewd curiosity. I spent the next hour on that park bench, laying out the entire sordid story. I told him about building Vaughn Hayes from the ground up, about my vision for the Blackwood Building, about the dinner, the folder, the hidden files on the server. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I presented the facts with the same cold, hard clarity Richard had always claimed I lacked. I was all business. When I finished, Arthur was silent for a while, watching the swan boats make another lazy circle. "He's a piranha in a bespoke suit, your husband," he finally said. "Thinks he invented the game. He doesn't respect the foundation. He only respects the leverage. And right now, he thinks he has all of it." He looked directly at me. "So, you want to sue him?" "My lawyer says it's a losing battle," I admitted. "It would take years, cost a fortune, and he's insulated himself perfectly. He expects me to fight him in court. He's prepared for it. I want to do something he'll never see coming." Arthur smiled then, a slow, grim smile that lit up his weathered face. "Good," he said. "Never fight an enemy on his chosen field of battle. Legal battles are wars of attrition. You don't have his resources. But a strategic strike, a public humiliation, that's a different language. And it's the only one men like Richard truly understand. You want to hurt him? You don't take his money. You take his prize." "The Blackwood Building," I said, my heart starting to beat faster. "Exactly," Arthur nodded. "It's not just a building to him. It's a monument to his own genius. It's his coronation. If someone else gets it, especially if he doesn't see it coming, it won't just be a financial loss. It will be a catastrophic blow to his ego. And his ego is the load-bearing wall of his entire world." The next day, I met him at his office. It wasn't the sleek, minimalist glass box that Richard favored. It was a dusty, chaotic suite of rooms above a pastry shop in the North End, filled with yellowing blueprints, architectural models, and books stacked to the ceiling. It was the den of a man who loved buildings, not just the profits they generated. We spent the day huddled over a map of the financial district, a pot of stale coffee between us. Arthur was a master strategist. He knew the players, the banks, the city zoning board members. He laid out the battlefield for me. "The bid for Blackwood is a sealed bid auction," he explained. "All interested parties submit their final offer by a deadline. The seller, a family trust out of New York, opens them all at once. Highest bidder wins. It's clean, simple, and supposed to be anonymous until the end." "So we just need to bid higher than him," I said. "It's not that simple," Arthur countered, tapping a pen on the map. "First, you need capital. A lot of it. The bid will be north of $100 million. You need to be a pre-qualified, credible buyer." My heart sank. He was offering me a buyout of $10 million. It was a fortune, but it wasn't enough to buy the Blackwood Building. Then, I remembered something. My grandmother. She had been a quiet, frugal woman, but she was a shrewd investor. When she passed away a few years ago, she'd left me her portfolio. Richard had glanced at it once, saw a collection of old economy stocks, railroads, energy, manufacturing, and dismissed it as sleepy money. He'd advised me to let his broker manage it. I'd refused, one of the few times I'd ever defied his financial advice, more out of sentiment than strategy. I hadn't looked at the portfolio in detail since then. That night, I logged into my inheritance account for the first time in years. My hands were shaking. What Richard had failed to realize, in his tech-obsessed, modern finance bubble, was the power of slow, steady growth and reinvested dividends over 50 years. He also hadn't noticed that among the sleepy stocks were several small, regional tech companies my grandmother had bought into in the early 90s, companies that had since been acquired by the giants of Silicon Valley. The number at the bottom of the screen made me gasp. It wasn't 10 million. It was just shy of $35 million. It was my secret weapon. The war chest he never knew I had. When I told Arthur the next morning, his eyes widened. The arrogant fool, he chuckled. He never even bothered to look at your hand. He just assumed you were holding nothing. The plan began to solidify. We couldn't bid as Elara Hayes. Richard would be alerted immediately. We needed a ghost. We'll form a new limited liability company, Arthur said, already sketching on a notepad. Completely anonymous. We'll register it in Delaware for maximum privacy. We'll give it a name that means nothing to anyone. We brainstormed names. I suggested something strong, something that spoke of defiance. Arthur shook his head. No. Nothing aggressive. Something forgettable. Something that sounds like a dusty old holding firm. That's our camouflage. I looked at the history books on his shelves, thinking about Richard's obsession with legacies and empires. I thought of Old English kings. What about Ethelred Holdings? I asked. Ethelred the Unready. The king who was famously ill-advised and unprepared for invasion. Arthur's eyes twinkled. Perfect, he said. The poetry is delicious. For the next 2 weeks, we worked in the shadows. Arthur called in old favors, connecting me with a discreet law firm in Wilmington and a private banker who owed him his career. We registered Ethelred Holdings. I liquidated a significant portion of my grandmother's portfolio and wired the funds into a new commercial bank account. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing I had ever done. While we built our ghost company, Richard was tightening the screws. I was officially locked out of the Von Hayes offices. He sent a series of increasingly threatening letters from Marcus Thorne, demanding I sign the dissolution agreement. He cut off my access to our joint accounts, trying to starve me into submission. He was waging a conventional war, using brute force. He had no idea I was digging a tunnel right under his feet. I played the part he expected me to play. I ignored his lawyer's letters. I moved into a small apartment in Cambridge, making it look like I was retreating, beaten. He would hear through the grapevine that I was a wreck, that I was broken. Let him think it. Let his guard down. The final piece of the plan was the bid itself. We couldn't just throw all my money at it. We needed to know Richard's number. And that, I realized, was where my emotional connection to the business, the very thing he despised, would become my greatest weapon. I knew the people. I knew the architects, the engineers, the junior analysts he'd hired and fired. I knew who was loyal and who harbored a grudge. My war was about to move from the boardroom to the streets. Richard's greatest weakness was his belief that loyalty could be bought and that fear was a sustainable management tool. He treated his subordinates as disposable cogs in his machine, and he'd left a trail of disgruntled, underappreciated people in his wake. These were my people now. I started with a call to Sarah, a young architectural analyst Richard had fired 6 months ago. He'd claimed her work was sloppy, but I knew the real reason. She had corrected him on a zoning regulation in front of a major investor, and his ego couldn't handle it. I met her for coffee at a small cafe in Somerville, far from the prying eyes of the financial district. At first, she was guarded, fearful of Richard's reach. But as I explained my situation, not as a powerful executive but as another woman he had wronged, her defenses crumbled. "He called me hysterical for pointing out his mistake," she said, her voice laced with remembered anger. "He told me I needed to learn my place. I didn't ask her to steal anything or break any laws. I just asked her what she remembered about the Blackwood project's financials." Her mind was a steel trap. She had been the one who ran the initial budget projections. He was always obsessed with a specific profit margin, Sarah recalled. 22%. It was his magic number. He'd fudge any number he had to in order to make the initial projections show a 22% return on investment within 7 years. She explained his bidding strategy. Richard would calculate his absolute maximum price, the number beyond which his precious margin would be compromised, and then submit a bid just below it, confident that his aggression would scare off any serious competition. He wouldn't bid his max, he'd bid what he thought was just enough to win, to show how clever he was. She walked me through the likely costs, the contingency funds he'd have allocated, the projected revenue streams from my own designs. By the time we finished our second coffee, we had a number. A very specific number. Richard's ceiling. My next stop was a chance encounter with David Chin, a lead engineer from a firm Richard frequently used. I knew David was an avid runner, and I knew his route along the Charles River Esplanade. I staged a casual run-in near the hatch shell. After the initial awkwardness, I steered the conversation to his work. I played the part of the wounded, cast-off wife, curious about the legacy I was no longer a part of. "Richard is so driven," I said with a sigh. "He must be working you all to the bone on the Blackwood bid." David, a fundamentally decent man who Richard treated like a glorified calculator, softened. "It's an ambitious project," he said carefully. "The foundation work alone is a nightmare. The original soil reports were optimistic." My ears perked up. "Optimistic?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "That old part of the city is all landfill." We told him the bedrock was deeper than projected and there was significant soil contamination from an old coal gasification plant. "The remediation costs will be astronomical. At least $7 million more than what was in the initial budget." My mind raced. Had Richard disclosed that to the investors? To the bank? "I'm sure Richard has it all under control," I said, forcing a smile. "He always does." "Of course," David said, unconvincingly. He looked uncomfortable, clearly caught between his professional duty and his dislike for our shared acquaintance. But he had given me everything I needed. Richard wasn't just cutting me out, he was likely committing fraud. He was hiding the true cost of the cleanup to make his numbers look better for his loan application and his investors. This was the silver bullet. The piece of information that could not only cost him the deal but could potentially land him in serious legal trouble. Arthur and I debated what to do with the information. Arthur, the old brawler, wanted to leak it to the bank anonymously and blow up Richard's financing before the bid. "Cut the head off the snake," he urged. But I had a better idea. A colder one. "No," I said. "We don't stop him from bidding. We let him walk right into the trap. We let him win the prize, and then we watch it turn to ash in his hands." The new plan was far more devastating. We wouldn't use the information about the soil contamination to stop the sale. We would let him submit his bid, based on his fraudulent numbers. We would outbid him. And once I owned the building, I would make sure the real environmental report made its way to the right people, specifically, his bankers and investors, who had funded him based on a lie. Not only would he lose his legacy project, but his financial backing for all future deals would evaporate. He would be ruined. This was no longer just about a building. It was about dismantling the myth of Richard Vaughan, the infallible genius. It was about showing the world that his empire was a house of cards built on a toxic foundation. While Richard was busy sending me legal threats, I was gathering my forces. I was no longer a victim. I was a general preparing for battle. The day before the bids were due, I did one last thing. I went back to the brownstone with a key I wasn't supposed to have. He was out, at a final pre-bid dinner with his new partners. I packed a single box of my personal things, books, photos, my grandmother's letters. I walked through the house that no longer felt like mine, a ghost in my own past. In his sterile, perfect office, I left my wedding ring on the polished surface of his desk. Right next to it, I placed a small, hardback copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Let him wonder what that meant. He would find out soon enough. The morning of the bid opening was gray and overcast, the Boston sky the color of slate. It matched my mood perfectly, calm, cold, and heavy with unspoken intentions. I didn't wear a power suit. I chose a simple, elegant sheath dress in a deep charcoal gray. It was the same dress I had worn to Mama Maria the night my world fell apart. It felt appropriate. A bookend to that chapter of my life. Arthur and I met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the law firm where the bids would be opened. He looked at me, a flicker of concern in his sharp eyes. Last chance to back out, Elara. Once we walk into that room, the die is cast. He cast it months ago, I replied, taking a sip of black coffee. I'm just deciding where it lands. Arthur nodded, a grim smile on his face. Give them hell. The law firm's conference room was on the 40th floor, with panoramic views of the city Richard so desperately wanted to conquer. The air was thick with tension and the smell of expensive coffee. There were representatives from the sellers, the New York Trust, their lawyers, and 3 other bidding parties. And then there was Richard. He stood by the window, a king surveying his domain, oozing a confident charisma that turned my stomach. He was with Marcus Thorne, both of them laughing at some private joke. He saw me enter, and his smile tightened into a contemptuous smirk. He clearly assumed I was there to make a desperate, emotional plea. A final, pathetic scene. He sauntered over, his $600 shoes silent on the plush carpet. Elara, he said, his voice low and patronizing. This is neither the time nor the place. You're embarrassing yourself. I'm just here to observe, I said coolly, my voice betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I have a vested interest in the outcome, after all. His eyes narrowed. He was confused, and he didn't like being confused. Your interest ended when you refused my generous offer. You have no standing here. Let's see, I said, turning my attention to the front of the room as the seller's lead attorney, a Mr. Davenport, called the meeting to order. I took a seat in the back, away from the main table. Arthur wasn't with me. Our strategy required that Ethelred Holdings remain a complete mystery until the final moment. I was just a spectator to Richard's coronation. Mr. Davenport, a man with a voice as dry as old parchment, began to read the submitted bids. They were identified only by bidder number. Bidder 1, from Sterling Commercial Properties, $96,500,000. A polite murmur went through the room. A strong opening bid. Bidder 2, from the Omni Group, $98 million. Richard shifted in his seat, looking unconcerned. He knew his competition, and he knew they wouldn't go much higher. Bidder 3, Davenport continued, from Vaughn Legacy Ventures. He paused, and I saw Richard's chest puff out. This was his moment. $107,250,000. A collective gasp went through the room. It was an overwhelming, knockout bid. Aggressive, decisive, and clearly designed to obliterate the competition. Richard shot a triumphant glance back at me, a look of pure, smug victory. He thought he had won. He was already picturing the headlines, the groundbreaking ceremony, the bronze plaque with his name on it. He winked at me. The utter disrespect of it almost made me lose my composure. But I held his gaze, my expression a perfect, unreadable blank. And the fourth and final bid, Davenport announced, picking up the last envelope. It was a simple, plain manila envelope. No fancy logo. From a group called Ethelred Holdings. Richard frowned slightly, the name clearly meaning nothing to him. Davenport cleared his throat. $108 million. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. The air crackled. Richard's face, which had been a mask of triumph, froze. The blood drained from it, leaving it a sickly white. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. "Who?" he choked out. "Who the hell is Ethelred Holdings?" Mr. Davenport looked down at his papers. "They are a private investment group registered in Delaware. Their bid is valid, fully funded, and is the highest received. Pending final contractual details, they are the new owners of the Blackwood Building." Richard shot to his feet, his chair scraping backward. "This is unacceptable. We don't know who these people are. I demand to know who is behind this." "Their principal representative is in the room," Davenport said calmly, looking out over the assembled people. And then, I stood up. I walked from the back of the room to the main table, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the floor. Every eye was on me. I felt like I was walking through water, the moment stretching into an eternity. I reached the table and placed a simple business card in front of Mr. Davenport. It read, "Elara Hayes, Managing Partner, Ethelred Holdings." I didn't look at Richard, but I could feel the heat of his gaze on me. It was like standing next to a furnace. The silence was finally broken by Marcus Thorne, who whispered hoarsely, "That's not possible." I finally turned to face my husband. The smugness, the confidence, the arrogance, it had all been stripped away, leaving behind something ugly and raw. He looked at me as if he'd never seen me before. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "How?" he finally croaked, the single word filled with a universe of bewildered rage. "Where did you get that kind of money?" I leaned in slightly, my voice a quiet whisper that only he could hear. "You were right about one thing, Richard. Business isn't emotional. It's about knowing the value of your assets. And you never, ever knew the value of mine." I walked out of that room without a backward glance. I didn't need to see his empire begin to crumble. I could feel it. The shockwaves were just the beginning. The real devastation would come when his investors and his bank received a certain, highly detailed, and very expensive report on soil contamination. He hadn't just lost a building. He had lost everything, and he just didn't know it yet. The aftermath was not a loud explosion, but a slow, quiet implosion. I didn't stick around to watch. I had work to do. My first act as the owner of the Blackwood Building was to hire a new environmental firm to conduct a thorough, public, and transparent assessment of the soil contamination. The report, when it came out 2 weeks later, was exactly as devastating as David Chen had predicted. The cost of the cleanup would be closer to $10 million, not the $1 million Richard had budgeted for in the documents he'd shown the bank. I didn't have to leak the report. I simply sent a copy, as a professional courtesy, to the CEO of Boston Merchant Bank, the same bank that had funded Richard's bid. I included a short, simple note, "Thought you should see what you were really funding." That was all it took. A single match on a trail of gasoline. The bank launched an internal fraud investigation. Richard's line of credit, the lifeblood of his entire operation, was frozen and then revoked. The investors he had courted for Vaughn Legacy Ventures, seeing the headlines about the investigation and realizing they'd been shown fraudulent projections, pulled out in a panic. They sued him for misrepresentation. Marcus Thorne, ever the shark, cut a deal with the investors and turned on Richard to save his own skin, providing emails and documents that proved Richard had knowingly concealed the environmental report. It was a complete and total rout. I heard about most of it secondhand, through whispers in the real estate community and the occasional blurb in the Boston Business Journal. Richard was forced to sell off assets from our old company, Vaughn Hayes, at fire sale prices just to cover his legal fees. The empire he had bragged about was being sold for parts. I finalized our divorce through lawyers. He tried to fight it, of course, tried to claim that Ethelred Holdings was a shared marital asset. My lawyer eviscerated his claim in court, presenting the timeline of his own deception, showing that he had dissolved our partnership before I had formed my new company. He was left with a fraction of what he had tried to steal from me. One afternoon, months later, I was at the Blackwood site. The grand old building was now surrounded by scaffolding, the sound of saws and hammers echoing in the cavernous space. I was walking the ground floor with my new architectural team, a group of brilliant, creative women, discussing plans to expose the original brickwork. I looked out the massive, arched doorway and saw him across the street. He was just standing there, watching. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive suits. He looked smaller, diminished. His shoulders were slumped. He looked like a man who had lost his shadow. Our eyes met across the bustling street. I saw a flicker of something in his expression, not just anger anymore, but a deep, hollowed-out confusion. He still didn't understand how he had lost. He saw me, surrounded by my team, in control, building the dream he had tried to take from me. I didn't smile. I didn't sneer. I simply held his gaze, and then I turned back to my blueprints, dismissing him from my world as completely as he had once dismissed me. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The project took 2 years. 2 years of dust, sweat, and incredibly hard work. We restored the Gothic facade, polished the marble floors, and transformed the dark, forgotten spaces into places of light and life. The Blackwood Hotel opened to critical acclaim, becoming the new heart of the old district. I never saw Richard again, but his story became a quiet cautionary tale in the city's boardrooms, a ghost story about the dangers of arrogance. Tonight, I am standing on the rooftop bar of my hotel. The city stretches out before me, a glittering tapestry of light and ambition. The bar is full of people laughing, their voices mixing with the cool night air. It's a success, bigger and more beautiful than I had ever dreamed. Down below, the streets are alive, the city breathing. He was right about one thing. I am an emotional person. My emotion is what allowed me to see the beauty in a derelict building. My anger is what fueled my fight. My passion is what rebuilt my life from the ashes of his betrayal. He built his empire on the belief that I felt too much, and in the end, the only thing I felt for him was nothing at all. The end.